That cold morning, no one expected an act of compassion to change everything. What started as another quiet day near the reserve became a story the whole town tried to explain, and few had the courage to tell. Before we begin, subscribe and turn on the bell. Here, every roar and every breath matters, because behind every white tiger there is a story worth saving. The frost clung to the pines like a fragile promise, the kind that breaks under the weight of winter's indifference. It was just past dawn at the edge of Blackwood Reserve, where the forest met the cracked asphalt of Highway 47, a forgotten stretch of road that wound through the rural sprawl of upstate New York. The air hung heavy with the scent of damp earth and pine resin, sharp enough to sting the lungs. No birds called. The world held its breath, as if sensing the tremor in the underbrush. Ranger Elias Thorne had been up since 4, his pickup truck rumbling along the perimeter fence, headlights cutting through the grey haze. He was a man in his late 50s, broad-shouldered but weathered, with calluses on his hands from years of mending nets and soothing panicked deer. Elias had seen it all in his decades here: poachers, traps, orphaned fawns, the occasional black bear raiding trash bins. But nothing prepared him for the sound that stopped him cold. A low, ragged whimper, not quite a roar, threading through the trees like a plea swallowed by the wind. He killed the engine, the sudden silence amplifying the crunch of his boots on frozen leaves. Steam rose from the truck's hood, curling into the chill. Elias grabbed his flashlight and radio, his breath fogging the air as he pushed into the thicket. The reserve wasn't supposed to hold tigers, white ones especially. Those ghosts of the wild belonged to distant jungles, smuggled in by collectors or escaped from roadside zoos gone bankrupt. But rumors had swirled for months, sightings of a pale shadow slipping through the nights, too ethereal to be real. Elias had dismissed them as trucker tales until now. Deeper in, where the undergrowth tangled like forgotten regrets, he found her. The white tigress lay sprawled on a bed of pine needles, her massive form heaving with labored breaths. Her fur, once a pristine cascade of snow and shadow stripes, was matted with mud and flecks of blood. Nothing graphic, just the quiet evidence of struggle. Her eyes, golden slits in the dim light, fixed on him with a desperation that pierced deeper than any claw. She wasn't charging, wasn't baring fangs. She was crying, in the way only a creature of instinct could, a soft, keening rumble from her chest, vibrating the air like a heartbeat fading. Around her the ground was disturbed, as if she'd dragged herself here from miles away, seeking something, shelter perhaps, or the edge of human territory where help might linger. Elias froze, his hand hovering over the radio. "Dispatch, this is Thorne," he whispered into it, voice steady but edged with awe. "Got a situation at the north fence. Big cat down. Looks like a white tiger. Female. She's in bad shape." Static crackled back, then a voice from the station. "Repeat that, Elias. A tiger. You sure it's not a cougar?" He wasn't sure of anything, but the sight of her, those impossible white flanks rising and falling, rooted him. She lifted her head slightly, nostrils flaring at his scent, and let out another whimper, weaker this time, her body curling protectively around her swollen belly. In labor, he realized with a gut punch, alone, exposed, on the brink. Word spread like frost across the reserve's small network. By mid-morning, the scene had drawn a reluctant circle of witnesses. Dr. Lena Hargrove arrived first, the local vet from Willow Creek, a town 10 miles down the highway, where clapboard houses huddled against the wind. Lena was in her 40s, sharp-eyed behind wire-rimmed glasses, her vet bag slung over one shoulder like a soldier's pack. She'd treated everything from farm dogs to injured hawks, but wildlife like this, it was a line she rarely crossed, too risky, too rare. "Elias, you can't be serious," she said, her voice low as she approached, boots sinking into the soft earth. The tigress's eyes tracked her, unblinking, a silent judgment in their depths. Lena knelt at a safe distance, gloved hands assessing from afar. She's exhausted, dehydrated. If she's birthing, it's complicated, maybe malpositioned. But touching her, one swipe, and we're done. Next came Harlan Beck, the grizzled handyman from the reserve's maintenance shed, a man who'd lost faith in miracles after his wife passed 2 winters back. He leaned against a tree, arms crossed, his face a mask of skepticism. "Shoot it," he muttered to no one in particular, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. "Or call the state boys. Thing like that doesn't belong here. Escaped freak show or whatever. It's a danger waiting to happen." The words hung in the air, heavy as the gathering clouds. Elias shot him a look but said nothing. Harlan's stance was common enough in these parts, where fear dressed as practicality. The Tigress, sensing the tension, let out a shuddering breath, her flanks trembling. No roar of threat, just vulnerability, raw and pleading. Then there was Mia Ruiz, a young wildlife photographer who'd been staking out the reserve for her portfolio, her camera slung around her neck like a talisman. She'd heard the radio chatter on her scanner and driven up in her battered Jeep, dust still settling on the hood. Mia was an outsider, fresh from the city, with a quiet fire in her eyes that spoke of unfinished stories. She didn't speak at first, just watched from the tree line, lens focused on the tigress's face. The animal's gaze met the camera's eye, and Mia's hand shook, not from cold, but from the weight of what she saw. Innocence trapped in a body built for legends, now reduced to this fragile curl on the forest floor. "She's not dangerous," Mia finally whispered, stepping closer despite Lena's warning glance. "Look at her. She's begging." The group stood in uneasy silence, the tigress's breaths the only rhythm breaking the quiet. Elias felt it then, the moral suspense coiling like smoke. Call animal control and risk her death in transit? Leave her to nature's mercy, where predators or the cold would claim her and her unborn? Or step in, defy the rules and face whatever came? The air smelled of wet fur and distant rain, the tigress's whimpers fading into ragged gasps. Her eyes, those golden pools, seemed to hold the forest's secrets, pleading without words. If they turned away now, the story ended here, in the mud, forgotten. But one among them, the one no one expected, would kneel first. As the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows through the pines, the tigress's body convulsed once, a soft cry escaping her throat. The decision hung unspoken, a thread pulling them all toward the unknown. In that moment, the reserve's edge felt like the world's, where compassion and fear blurred into something unbreakable. The clouds thickened overhead, turning the mid-morning light into a muted grey that filtered through the pines like smoke from a dying fire. Elias Thorne stood rooted, his radio crackling faintly in his pocket, forgotten for the moment as the tigress's body arched in another weak contraction. The sound she made wasn't a roar, more a guttural sigh, laced with exhaustion, her white fur rippling like disturbed snow. The air grew heavier, carrying the faint metallic tang of her strain, mingling with the earthy dampness of the forest floor. No one moved closer. The circle of onlookers held its breath, each face etched with the quiet calculus of risk and regret. Lena Hargrove adjusted her glasses, her knees pressing into the needle-strewn ground as she scanned the tigress from 10 feet away. Her vet bag lay open beside her, instruments glinting dully, syringes, bandages, a stethoscope that seemed absurdly small against the animal's bulk. "She's in active labor," Lena murmured, more to herself than the others, her voice a clinical anchor in the swelling unease. "But see how her sides heave. That's distress. Could be the cubs are too big, or she's been on the run too long without food. We need to sedate her if we're doing anything." Her words trailed off, eyes flicking to Elias, who nodded slowly, his weathered hands clenched at his sides. He'd radioed for backup, but the state wildlife team was hours away, tangled in bureaucracy and the endless loop of Highway 47's curves. Harlan Beck shifted his weight, boots scraping against a root, his skepticism hardening into something sharper. Sedate, for what? That thing's a liability, Elias. White tiger, probably some circus reject, half-starved and mean as hell. You saw the mud on her. She's been tearing through brush like a demon. One wrong move, and she's got your arm off. He spat to the side, not in anger exactly, but in the way men do when fear masquerades as common sense. Harlan's eyes avoided the tigresses, fixing instead on the fence line, where the reserve's wire sagged under winter's weight. He'd fixed that fence a dozen times, patching holes left by coyotes or careless hikers. But this felt like inviting chaos into the order he'd built his life around since losing Sarah. Compassion was a luxury he couldn't afford anymore, not when every shadow in the woods reminded him of what he'd failed to save. Mia Ruiz lowered her camera, the shutter's click echoing softly in the hush. She was closer now, drawn by an invisible pull, her breath visible in the cooling air. The tigress's golden eyes met hers again, holding steady despite the pain etching lines around them. No snarl, no retreat, just a quiet vigilance, as if the animal sensed the flicker of understanding in Mia's gaze. "She's not tearing through anything," Mia said softly, her voice cutting through Harlan's grumble like a breeze through branches. "Look at her paws. They're cracked, bleeding from running. She's come here because she has to. This isn't her world." Mia's hands trembled as she spoke, not from the cold that nipped at her fingers, but from the weight of the scene unfolding before her lens. She'd come to Blackwood chasing images of elusive foxes and deer at dawn, stories of the wild that fit neatly into her portfolio. But this tigress, with her pleading rumble fading into silence, demanded more than a photograph. It demanded witness. Elias felt the group's fracture like a crack in the earth beneath him. He glanced at the tigress, her body curling tighter around the invisible burden within, her breaths coming in shallow, ragged pulls that stirred the leaves around her. The forest seemed to lean in, the pines whispering secrets in the wind, their branches swaying like silent judges. No one had called for the gun yet, but the option hung unspoken, a shadow at the edge of every glance. Elias remembered a fawn last spring, twisted in barbed wire, its eyes mirroring this same desperate plea. He'd cut it free, held it as it slipped away, whispering apologies to the empty woods. But a tiger? The scale tipped into the unknown, where instinct clashed with duty. Lena pulled a syringe from her bag, the sedative's vial catching the dim light. "If we wait for the state, she'll deliver here. Exposed, no chance for the cubs. I can try a low dose, just enough to ease her, but someone has to get close." Her words landed like stones in still water, rippling through the group. Harlan snorted, stepping back a pace, his arms folding tighter. "Not it. I've got a family down the road. Can't be the fool who gets mauled for a ghost cat." Mia's eyes widened, her camera forgotten on its strap, but she didn't volunteer. The fire in her was real, yet tempered by the reality of those massive paws, still and waiting. The tigress stirred then, her head lifting with effort, nostrils flaring as another contraction gripped her. A low keen escaped, vibrating through the air, not aggressive but heartbreaking. A mother's silent cry for aid in a world that had forgotten her kind. Elias's chest tightened, the sound echoing the hollow ache he'd carried since his own daughter left for the city years ago, seeking lights brighter than the reserve's dim glow. He took a step forward, then another, the crunch of his boots the only sound, breaking the tension. The others watched, breaths held as he knelt slowly, palms open at his sides. "Easy, girl," he whispered, voice rough with emotion he rarely let surface. Her eyes locked on his, golden depths reflecting the pine's shadows, and for a moment the forest held still. No judgment, no fear, just the raw thread of connection, fragile as frost, But as Elias reached for the syringe, Lena tossed his way. The tigress's body seized again, a deeper convulsion rolling through her. She shifted, paw scraping the earth, and the group tensed. Harlan muttered a curse, backing toward the truck, while Mia's hand flew to her mouth, stifling a gasp. Lena's face paled behind her glasses. The moral weight pressed down, heavier than the clouds above. Turn away and let nature claim its due. Act and risk everything for a creature that might never trust the hand extended. Elias's fingers closed around the syringe, his heart hitching at the tigress's next breath. A weak, pleading exhale that seemed to carry the weight of forgotten wilds. In that suspended silence, the reserve's edge blurred into something profound, where one man's choice would echo through the trees, reshaping them all. The wind picked up, carrying the distant hum of an approaching engine, but for now the world narrowed to the tigress's eyes, urging him onward into the unknown. The syringe trembled in Elias Thorne's grip, its needle catching the muted light like a sliver of ice. He was on his knees now, mere feet from the tigress, the forest floor pressing damp and unyielding against his jeans. Her breaths came in shallow waves, each one stirring the pine needles into faint eddies, carrying the subtle musk of her fur, wild and ancient, laced with the quiet desperation of impending birth. The air thickened with the scent of impending rain, the clouds low and brooding as if the sky itself mourned the tigress's solitude. Elias's pulse thrummed in his ears, louder than the distant rumble of thunder rolling in from the west. He'd faced down charging elk and snares that bit like traps, but this closeness, this voluntary surrender to her gaze, unraveled him. Those golden eyes held no threat, only a mirrored vulnerability that tugged at the frayed edges of his resolve. Lena Hargrove watched from her crouch position, her gloved hand hovering near her bag, ready with follow-up doses. "Slow, Elias," she whispered, her voice a threadbare lifeline in the hush. "Talk to her. Keep it steady. The sedative's fast-acting, but if she bolts—" She didn't finish. The implication hung like the mist coiling around the trees. Harlan Beck had retreated to the truck's shadow, his silhouette rigid against the pickup's faded red paint, arms crossed as if warding off the chill that had nothing to do with the weather. He said nothing now, but his silence screamed judgment, practicality over folly, survival over sentiment. Mia Ruiz stood frozen a few paces back, her camera raised again, not to capture but to bear witness, her breaths hitching in sync with the tigress's. The lens framed the moment, man and beast, divided by instinct yet bound by the raw pulse of life teetering on the edge. Elias extended his arm inch by inch, the syringe's plunger cool against his palm. "I'm not here to hurt you," he murmured, the words more for himself than the tigress, roughened by years of solitude in the reserve's quiet patrols. Her ears flicked at the sound, not in alarm but recognition, her massive head tilting ever so slightly. The contraction hit then, fiercer than before, a deep internal roll that arched her back and drew a low, keening rumble from her throat. It wasn't a cry of rage. It was the sound of a world fracturing inside her, the unborn cubs shifting in their fragile sanctuary. Her paw flexed against the earth, claws sheathing without intent, digging furrows that spoke of endurance rather than attack. Elias's hand faltered, the distance closing to a breath's width from her flank, where the white fur rose and fell like a tide ebbing. In that suspended heartbeat, the tigress's eyes locked onto his, golden depths reflecting the pine's somber green. No snarl twisted her muzzle. Instead, her gaze softened, a silent plea weaving through the pain. "Trust me, or perhaps help us." Elias pressed forward, the needle piercing the loose skin at her shoulder with a gentleness born of necessity. She stiffened, a tremor rippling through her massive frame, but she didn't lash out. The sedative coursed in, her body yielding with a sigh that seemed to echo the wind's whisper through the branches. Her eyelids drooped, the keen fading to a soft exhale, her form slumping heavier against the needles. Elias pulled back, syringe empty, his hands shaking as he wiped sweat from his brow. The forest exhaled with him, the tension uncoiling like a bowstring released. Lena moved in swiftly, her boots careful on the uneven ground, stethoscope pressed to the Tigress's side. "It's working," she said, voice laced with cautious relief. Heartbeat steadying. "Cubs are alive, but we can't wait. She's dilating, but the first one's breached wrong. Field delivery now, or we lose them all." She unpacked, with practiced efficiency, sterile drapes, instruments that gleamed coldly, a portable oxygen mask too small for such majesty. The air filled with the faint chemical whiff of antiseptic, clashing with the wild's earthy breath. Harlan finally stirred, edging closer despite himself, his skepticism cracking under the weight of the scene. "You're all mad," he grumbled, but his hands hovered, ready to assist with whatever makeshift restraint they might need. Mia lowered her camera, stepping forward to hold a light, her face pale but set, the fire in her eyes now a steady flame. The Tigress lay still under the drug's veil, her breaths evening into a rhythmic rise and fall. But even in sedation, her presence commanded the clearing. A symbol of misunderstood grace, her white coat stark against the muddied earth. Elias knelt beside Lena, his rough hands steadying the animal's head as she worked. The first cub emerged in a rush of fluid and struggle, tiny and slick, its fur a pale whisper of its mother's. Lena cradled it gently, clearing airways with trembling fingers, her breath catching at the sight. No mules yet, just the fragile uncertainty of new life, paws twitching in the cold air. "One down," she whispered, wrapping it in a warm towel from her bag. "But the next, it's tangled." The words landed heavy, the moral suspense reigniting. The Tigress stirred faintly, a low rumble vibrating through her chest, as if sensing the peril even in her haze. Outside their circle, the world intruded subtly, the hum of Mia's Jeep engine cooling in the distance, the first fat drops of rain pattering on the leaves overhead. Elias felt the pull of revelation stirring within him, unbidden, the echo of his daughter's laughter from years past. Lost to the city's pull, a failure he'd buried under layers of duty, this Tigress, with her pleading eyes now half-lidded in trust, mirrored that ache, a life reaching out, demanding he choose redemption over retreat. Harlan watched the cub, his gruff facade softening for a flicker, remembering perhaps his wife's gentle hands on their old collie in its final hours. Mia's tears welled, silent, as she documented the fragile miracle, the camera a bridge to the compassion she chased in every frame. As Lena delved deeper, the Tigress's body tensed again, a warning ripple under the sedative's hold. The second cub hung in limbo, the procedure teetering on crisis. Rain began in earnest, slicking the ground, turning the clearing into a hushed theater of survival. Elias's hand rested on the Tigress's flank, feeling the heat of her core, the instinctual fight within. No words passed. Silence wrapped them like the downpour, broken only by the soft patter and the Tigress's labored inhales. In this raw intimacy, fear gave way to something profound, a bond forged in the mud and rain, where humanity's trembling choices met the wild's unyielding hope. The reserve's edge pulsed with it, the pines standing sentinel as the story deepened, pulling them toward an unforeseen truth. The rain drummed steadily now, veiling the scene in a curtain of silver, but the Tigress's eyes fluttered open briefly, locking once more on Elias, a silent acknowledgement that shifted the air. Whatever came next, the line had been crossed. Compassion had claimed its ground. Comment where you're watching from. I want to know how far these stories of courage and compassion can travel. The rain fell in relentless sheets, turning the forest floor into a slick mosaic of mud and pine needles that clung to boots like reluctant memories. Elias Thorne's knees sank deeper into the yielding earth, his hands steady on the Tigress's flank, as Dr. Lena Hargrove worked with focused precision, her face a mask of determination etched by the downpour. The white tigress lay heavy under the sedative's embrace, her massive chest rising and falling in measured rhythms that belied the chaos within. Water beaded on her fur, tracing rivulets down the pristine white, pooling in the hollows where exhaustion had carved its mark. The air hummed with the patter of drops on leaves, punctuated by the tigress's soft, involuntary exhales, each one a fragile thread holding life in place. No thunder now, just the steady drum that muffled the world beyond their circle, as if the sky wept for the unseen struggle. Lena's gloved hands moved with the quiet urgency of someone who knew the thin line between salvation and loss. The first cub, tiny and pale, mewled faintly from its towel-wrapped nest beside Mia Ruiz, who cradled it against her chest, her body shielding it from the chill. The sound was faint, a whisper against the rain, but it stirred something primal in the group, a reminder that survival here wasn't solitary. "The second one's turned," Lena said, her voice low and strained, barely rising above the downpour. She adjusted her position, rain dripping from the brim of her hood, her glasses fogging despite her wipes. "Breach. If I can't reposition it soon, the mother, she'll bleed out." The words hung unspoken in full, but Elias felt their weight, pressing against his ribs like the damp cold seeping through his jacket. The tigress's body tensed under his touch, a subtle ripple of instinct fighting the drug's haze, her golden eyes half open now, fixed on the space where the cubs should be. Harlan Beck hovered at the edge, his reluctance fracturing as he handed over a tarp from the truck, its plastic crinkling like a reluctant confession. He didn't meet anyone's gaze, his broad frame silhouetted against the blurring trees. But his hands betrayed him, steady as he helped drape it overhead, creating a meager shelter that flapped in the wind. The rain slicked his hair, running in rivulets down his weathered face, washing away the last traces of his earlier bluster. He'd come here expecting to fix a fence or chase off a stray, not to witness this intimate battle, where the wild's majesty unraveled into something achingly human. A memory flickered unbidden. Sarah's hand in his during her final hours, the quiet plea in her eyes mirroring the tigress's now. He pushed it down, focusing on the practical, the tarp's knots, the angle to keep the worst of the wet at bay, but the silence between actions spoke louder, a judgment yielding to quiet complicity. Mia's free hand steadied the light, its beam cutting through the grey like a hesitant dawn, illuminating Lena's work. The photographer's breaths came quick and shallow, her coat sodden, but she didn't retreat. The cub against her warmed slowly, its tiny paws kneading in nascent strength, and she felt the tigress's gaze shift toward it, a brief, instinctive pull that softened the air between them. No words from Mia, her silence was her vigil, the camera forgotten in the jeep, replaced by this tangible act. The rain masked the tears tracking her cheeks, born not just from the cold, but from the raw vulnerability unfolding. A mother stripped of her defenses, relying on strangers in a world that had hunted her kind to shadows. Elias's fingers traced gentle circles on the tigress's side, a rhythm born of old habits with injured dews and lost fawns, his touch a bridge across the chasm of species. The sedative held, but her body fought on, muscles contracting in waves that vibrated through him. "Hold on," he whispered, the words lost to the rain, but felt in the press of his palm. Lena delved deeper, her movements careful, probing the tangled form within. Time stretched, marked by the tigress's breaths, labored, then easing, then ragged again. A low rumble built in her chest, not a threat, but a vibration of endurance, echoing the thunder that had faded into the west. The second cub shifted at last, a subtle give under Lena's guidance, emerging in a rush that left the vet's hands slick and trembling. She lifted it free, clearing its airways with swift, Practiced motions, the tiny form gasping its first breath, a weak cry that pierced the downpour like fragile hope. The tigress stirred more fully now, the sedative waning as her instincts surged. Her head lifted, nostrils flaring at the sense of her offspring, and she nosed toward them with a gentleness that belied her power. Elias eased back, giving space, his heart hitching at the sight. Mother and cubs reunited in the mud, her tongue rasping softly over their damp fur. But the crisis lingered. Blood darkened the earth beneath her, a quiet seep that Lena stanched with quick bandages, her face paling as she assessed. "She's stable. For now," the vet said, packing her tools with hands that shook from more than cold. "But she needs real care, a facility, warmth, monitoring. We can't leave her here. The cold will take her, or worse." The words ignited the rising tension anew, the group's fragile unity fracturing under the logistics of what came next. Transport a sedated tigress through pouring rain on rutted forest paths, risk the state's indifference or the town's fearful calls for control. Harlan broke the silence first, his voice gruff but laced with something softer. "Truck's got room in the bed. Line it with blankets, secure her. But if she wakes mid-drive—" He trailed off, glancing at Elias, the skepticism now tempered by the cub's mules. Mia nodded, shifting the first cub closer, her eyes meeting the tigress's in a wordless pact. The rain eased to a drizzle, the clouds parting just enough to silver the scene, but the moral suspense coiled tighter. Elias rose slowly, joints protesting the hours on his knees, and radioed the station again, his voice steady despite the tremor in his chest. Backup was en route, but hours away. The decision fell to them, here in the clearing's hush. As they prepared the makeshift transport, a deeper truth began to surface in Elias, unbidden and sharp. The tigress's eyes followed him, golden and knowing, stirring echoes of his daughter Lily, gone 5 years now, chasing dreams in the city's sprawl, her last call a plea he hadn't heeded in time. He'd failed her then, buried in the reserve's routines, letting distance claim what fear wouldn't. This tigress, with her silent trust, reframed it all. Redemption wasn't in grand gestures, but in kneeling when the world urged retreat. He lifted the first cub carefully, placing it near its mother, and felt her breath warm against his skin, a bond forged in rain and resolve. Harlan assisted without protest, his own ghosts whispering of second chances, while Mia captured the moment not with a lens, but with presence. The extraction began under the fading drizzle. The tigress's form eased onto a stretcher of branches and tarp, her cubs nestled close. The forest watched in silence, pines dripping their final tears as the group moved toward the truck. Steps measured against the slick ground. Tension hummed in every careful lift, every shared glance. Fear of her waking, of the road's hazards, of what the town would say. But beneath it, compassion bloomed, a quiet force pulling them forward. The tigress's breath steadied, her eyes half-lidded in weary gratitude, carrying them into the unknown where survival's weight would test them further. The highway waited, empty and gleaming, a ribbon of choices stretching into the gathering dusk. The truck's engine growled to life under the gathering dusk, its headlights carving twin beams through the drizzle-slicked path that snaked away from the clearing. Elias Thorne gripped the wheel, knuckles whitening against the worn leather as the vehicle lurched forward over roots and ruts, the stretcher in the bed shifting with every jolt. The white tigress lay secured beneath layers of blankets and tarp, her massive form a pale mound against the black plastic, her breaths muffled but audible over the rain's fading patter, a steady, reassuring rhythm that anchored him amid the uncertainty. The cubs nestled against her side, their tiny forms bundled in Mia's coat, mewling softly in the warmth they'd been denied for too long. The air inside the cab hung thick with the scent of wet earth and exhaust, mingling with the faint, wild musk that clung to Elias's clothes like an unspoken vow. Lena Hargrove sat beside him, her vet bag wedged between her feet, eyes fixed on the rearview mirror where the Tigress's outline flickered in the shadows. "Pulse is holding," she murmured, checking a portable monitor strapped to her wrist, its screen glowing faintly green. But the road's no friend to her. Any bump could tear those stitches. Her voice carried the weight of the hours behind them, her hands still trembling from the delivery, now clasped tightly in her lap, as if to still them. Harlan Beck followed in his own battered Ford, tail lights winking like hesitant signals through the mist, while Mia rode in the bed's edge for the first stretch, her body braced against the sides, one hand resting near the tarp. No one spoke of the risks aloud, the Tigress waking mid-transit, her instincts flaring in confusion, the state's team arriving too late or too indifferent, the town's whispers turning to demands for the freak cat's end. Silence wrapped the convoy like the encroaching night, broken only by the tires' hiss on wet asphalt as they merged onto Highway 47. The road stretched empty before them, a ribbon of faded yellow lines flanked by skeletal birches that bowed in the wind, their branches scraping the sky like forgotten prayers. Elias's mind wandered to the reserve's quiet mornings, patrols where solitude was a comfort, not this knife edge of choice. The Tigress's eyes haunted him, those golden slits, trusting in their plea, mirroring the ache he'd buried since Lily's departure. She'd called once, voice cracking over the line, needing him in ways he couldn't bridge from Blackwood's isolation. He'd stayed put, duty-bound, letting the distance widen until her letters stopped. Now, with the truck rumbling onward, that failure resurfaced, sharp as the cold seeping through the vents. Saving this Tigress wasn't absolution, but it was a step, a kneeling in the mud when retreat beckoned. Miles blurred into the gloom, the drizzle easing to a mist that fogged the windshield. Mia climbed into the cab at the first straightaway, her face pale and streaked with rain, cradling the monitor's readout. "She's stirring," she whispered, glancing back. The words ignited a spark of tension, the cab's air tightening. Elias eased off the gas, the engine's growl softening to a hum, but the Tigress's rumble built from the bed. A low, disoriented vibration that thrummed through the metal floorboards. Lena twisted in her seat, peering through the small rear window. "Sedatives wearing off faster than I thought. The berth, it burned through it. We need to pull over." Her breath hitched, the clinical tone fracturing into raw concern, her fingers drumming against the door handle. Harlan's truck slowed behind them, hazard lights flashing in silent agreement as Elias veered onto the shoulder, gravel crunching under the tires. The highway's emptiness amplified every sound, the tick of cooling metal, the wind's low moan through the pines, the Tigress's escalating keen. A sound not of fury but confusion, her body protesting the unnatural sway of transport. They spilled out into the chill, flashlights piercing the dark, converging on the bed where the tarp had slipped slightly. The Tigress's head lifted, golden eyes gleaming with the haze of awakening, nostrils flaring at the unfamiliar sense of oil and strangers. Her paw flexed against the restraints, loose ropes of cargo straps and belts now straining as instinct surged. No claws bared in malice, just the wild's reflexive bid for freedom, her massive frame shifting with a grace that belied the pain. "Easy," Elias breathed, climbing into the bed, his boots slipping on the slick surface. He placed a hand on her shoulder, feeling the heat radiating through the blanket, the subtle tremor of her muscles coiling. Lena approached with another syringe, but the Tigress's rumble deepened, vibrating the truck's frame, her eyes locking on Elias with that same piercing plea, now edged with the fear of captivity. Mia froze at the tailgate, her light steady, but her breath catching, tears welling anew at the sight. This symbol of untamed beauty, reduced to wary glances in the beam's glare. Harlan hung back, flashlight beam wavering, his gruff resolve cracking further. "She's gonna panic," he muttered, voice low, But he didn't retreat. Instead, he tossed up more blankets, his hands moving with uncharacteristic care. The crisis crested as the Tigress bucked once, a controlled heave that snapped a strap, her body half rising before pain grounded her with a shuddering exhale. Blood seeped through the bandage, dark against the white fur, and Lena lunged forward, injecting the booster into her haunch with a swift, trembling motion. The animal stilled, eyes fluttering shut, but the moment lingered. A heartbeat where danger and trust collided, the group's breaths sinking in collective relief. Elias stroked her flank, whispering fragments of reassurance into the night, the wind carrying them away like smoke. No one spoke of the near miss. The silence held the emotional turn, hands trembling as they retightened the bonds, tears held back against the mist. They pressed on, the convoy tighter now, headlights linked like a chain against the dark. Willow Creek's lights flickered on the horizon, a rural cluster of sodium glows where the rehab center waited, a modest facility for injured wildlife, its fences sturdy but untested against a tiger's might. Arrival came under a clearing sky, stars pricking through the clouds like hesitant witnesses. The center's night staff emerged, bleary-eyed and disbelieving, wheeling a reinforced gurney as Elias and Harlan eased the Tigress down, her cubs mewling in protest at the separation. Lena directed the transfer, her voice steadying into authority, but her eyes betrayed the toll, the hitching breath, the wiped brow. Inside the dimly lit holding area, concrete floors and steel bars softened by hay-strewn corners, the Tigress was settled into a warmed enclosure, IV lines snaking from her foreleg under Lena's watchful eye. The cubs were placed beside her, nursing weakly as her tongue rasped over them in instinctive comfort. Elias lingered at the observation window, the glass cool against his palm, watching her breaths even into sleep. The revelation stirred deeper now, unbidden. Lily's voice on that last call, pleading for a visit, a bridge across the miles. He'd chosen the reserved silence over her, letting fear of change keep him rooted. But here, in this sterile hush, the Tigress's trust reframed it, a silent justice, instinct demanding he act where he'd once faltered. Harlan clapped his shoulder, a gruff nod, the only acknowledgement of his own softening, while Mia slipped away to call the story in, her photos a testament to the bond forged. The night deepened, the center's hum a counterpoint to the highway's distant roar. Tension lingered in the air, the Tigress's recovery a fragile thread, but compassion had carved its path. Outside, the pines stood sentinel, whispering of survival's quiet victories, pulling the narrative toward truths yet unveiled. The white Tigress slept on, her presence a beacon in the dim light, urging the humans toward their own redemption in the shadows. The rehab center's fluorescent hum cast a sterile pallor over the holding area, where shadows pooled in the corners like unspoken doubts. Elias Thorne stood at the observation window, his breath fogging the glass in slow, uneven clouds, the chill from the concrete floor seeping through his boots. Outside, the night had deepened into an inky quiet, broken only by the distant drip of rain from the eaves and the faint rustle of wind through the chain-link perimeter. Inside, the white Tigress lay on a bed of fresh straw, her massive form curled protectively around the two cubs, their tiny flanks rising and falling in sync with hers. IV lines trailed from her foreleg to a dripping bag suspended on a steel pole, the fluid a lifeline against the pallor creeping into her gums. Her breaths came steady now, deeper than in the truck, but laced with a subtle rasp that echoed in the empty space, a reminder that survival here was borrowed, not owned. Lena Hargrove moved like a shadow among the monitors, her coat discarded on a nearby stool, sleeves rolled up to reveal arms marked by faint scratches from the field delivery. She checked the tigress's vitals with quiet efficiency, her stethoscope cold against the animal's side, drawing a faint ear twitch but no protest. The cubs nursed sporadically, their mules soft and insistent, stirring the mother into occasional licks of her rough tongue over their damp fur. No one else lingered. Harlan had muttered something about checking the fences and driven off into the dark, his truck's taillights fading like a reluctant exit. Mia had slipped away earlier, her phone pressed to her ear as she relayed fragments of the story to an editor, her voice hushed in the hallway. The center's night staff, a young tech named Riley and an older handler, Tom, hovered at the edges, their faces a mix of awe and wariness, whispering about the ghost cat that had upended their routine. Elias pressed his palm harder against the window, the coolness grounding him as memories surfaced unbidden, sharp as the night's bite. Lily's face flickered in his mind, her laughter echoing from a childhood hike through these same woods, her small hand in his as they tracked deer prints in the snow. She'd been 12 then, eyes wide with wonder at the wild secrets, dreaming of becoming a ranger like him. But time had pulled her away, first to college in the city, then to a life of bright lights and hurried calls that grew farther apart. The last one, 5 years back, had cracked something in him, her voice trembling over the line, admitting she was struggling, needing him to come, to bridge the gap he'd let widen with his stubborn routines. He'd promised, but the reserve's demands, fences to mend, patrols to run, had kept him rooted. Days turned to weeks, her pleas unanswered until silence claimed her. Word came later, an accident, fleeting and final, on rain-slicked streets far from Blackwood. Elias had buried the guilt under layers of solitude, patrolling alone, whispering to the trees what he couldn't say to her. The Tigress shifted in her enclosure, a low rumble vibrating through the bars, pulling him back. Her golden eyes opened fully now, fixing on him through the glass with that piercing clarity, as if she sensed the echo of his loss in the air between them. No snarl, no retreat, just a steady gaze that held the weight of instincts shared across the divide, protection unmet, lives teetering on the edge of abandonment. Elias's throat tightened, a hitch in his breath mirroring the rasp in hers. He'd knelt for her in the mud, chosen action over retreat, but now, in this hushed vigil, the deeper truth unraveled him. This wasn't just about a stray tiger, it was Lily's plea, reborn in fur and fang, demanding he confront the man who'd failed once. If he walked away now, letting the center's protocols take over, the quarantines, the distant zoos that might separate her from her cubs, it would seal that failure anew. Lena approached the window, her steps soft on the linoleum, wiping her hands on a towel, stained with faint traces of the day's chaos. "She's fighting," she said quietly, her voice a thread in the silence. "Infections setting in from the birth. Low-grade fever. The antibiotics are helping, but she's weak. Needs monitoring through the night, maybe fluids adjusted by dawn." Her eyes met his, shadowed with the same exhaustion etching his features. But there was a question in them, unspoken. Stay or go? The moral suspense coiled tighter, the center's quiet amplifying the stakes. Call in specialists from the state, risk their cold efficiency turning the Tigress into a case file, or defy the rules again, lingering here to ensure her bond with the cubs held, her strength returned. Tom, the handler, cleared his throat from the doorway, his grizzled face skeptical under the harsh light. Heard the town's buzzing already, folks calling her a menace, escaped from some collector upstate. If word spreads, they'll want her relocated or worse. His words landed heavy, a judgment rooted in years of dealing with fearful locals who saw wildlife as threats, not kin. Riley nodded, younger eyes wide, but said nothing, her hands twisting a clipboard. The Tigress's rumble deepened, a soft vibration that seemed to answer them, her paw curling around a cub, as if to shield it from the doubt. Elias felt the group's fracture anew, the silence between them thick with choices, practicality urging distance, compassion demanding presence. He pushed through the door into the enclosure's antechamber, the air warmer here, laced with the subtle musk of hay and wild. Lena followed, her breath catching as the tigress's eyes tracked them, unblinking. "What are you doing?" she whispered, but didn't stop him. Elias knelt at the inner barrier, close enough to feel the heat radiating from her, his hand extending through the slot with a fresh cloth dampened in soothing solution. She nosed it tentatively, her breath warm against his skin, a silent acceptance that hitched in his chest. The cubs stirred, one tumbling closer, its tiny form pressing against the bars, golden eyes mirroring its mother's, innocent, pleading. Tears welled unbidden, held back by the grit of years, as the emotional turn crested. This act, small and defiant, awakened the story's core. If they didn't fight for her now, no one would. Her survival mirrored his own buried hope, a redemption clawed from the silence. Tension rose as the night wore on, the tigress's temperature spiking despite the meds, her breaths quickening into shallow pants that echoed off the walls. Lena adjusted the IV, hands trembling in the dim light, while Elias stayed, whispering encouragements drawn from old patrol tales, stories of resilient does and foxes that bent but didn't break. The revelation deepened with each passing hour. The tigress recognized his voice, her ears perking at the cadence, as if scent and sound wove a thread back to the forest's edge. Lily's ghost lingered in that connection, reframing his failure, not as endpoint, but as the shadow propelling him here to choose kinship over isolation. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the fences, but inside, the bond solidified, a quiet justice delivered through instinct and trembling resolve. Dawn's first grey light filtered through the high windows, casting long shadows across the enclosure. The tigress's fever broke with a shuddering exhale, her body easing into deeper rest, cubs nestled secure. Elias rose stiffly, joints aching from the vigil, but lighter somehow, the weight of unspoken truths lifting like mist. Lena placed a hand on his shoulder, her nod a shared victory. The center stirred awake, but for now, in the hush before the world intruded, compassion held sway, a bridge between man and wild, urging them toward the horizon where hope walked free. If this story already has your heart, hit the like button. It helps the story of this white tiger reach more people who still believe in kindness. The first rays of dawn pierced the rehab center's high windows, painting the enclosure in soft golds that danced across the straw like fleeting promises. Elias Thorne lingered at the observation window, his silhouette etched against the glass, the night's vigil etching deeper lines into his face. The white tigress stirred within, her body uncoiling from the tight curl of survival, flanks rising with breaths that no longer rasped but flowed, deep instinctive draws that filled the space with quiet assurance. The cubs tumbled beside her, their pale fur fluffed against the chill, paws batting at shadows as they nursed and played in nascent exploration. No monitors beeped urgently now. The IV line had been removed hours ago, leaving only the faint scent of antiseptic lingering like a ghost of the crisis. Outside, the pines stood still in the crisp morning air, their branches heavy with last night's mist, whispering of endurance as the highway beyond hummed faintly with early traffic. Lena Hargrove entered the antechamber quietly, her steps muffled on the linoleum, carrying 2 mugs of steaming coffee that cut through the dawn's cool edge. She handed one to Elias without a word, her eyes reflecting the same weary relief that softened his gaze. The tigress lifted her head at their presence, golden eyes meeting theirs through the bars, not with the desperate plea of the forest floor, but with a steady calm, a silent acknowledgement woven from trust earned in mud and rain. Her tongue rasped once more over the cubs, drawing them closer, her massive form a shield reborn. The enclosure felt less like captivity now, more a temporary haven where wild instinct could mend. The steel softened by the play of light on her pristine white coat. Elias sipped the coffee, its bitterness grounding him as the revelation from the night deepened, settling like roots in fertile soil. Lily's memory no longer clawed at him with accusation. Instead, it intertwined with this moment. The tigress's eyes mirroring the innocence he'd lost, urging him to see redemption not as erasure, but as continuation. He'd failed her once, letting duty's silence swallow his steps. But here in the hush of the center, he'd chosen differently. Kneeling for the tigress had been his bridge, a small act rippling outward, reframing the hollow years into purpose. The cub's mules echoed that shift, fragile sounds blooming into strength, much like the quiet fire he'd rekindled within. No words passed between him and Lena. Their shared silence held the emotional truth, hands steady now, where they'd trembled before. Word of the Tigress had spread through Willow Creek by mid-morning, the rural town's clapboard houses buzzing with a mix of awe and lingering fear. Harlan Beck arrived first, his truck pulling up with a gravel crunch, his face unreadable under the brim of his cap. He peered through the window, arms crossed but posture eased. The skepticism of the forest clearing melted into something quieter. "Heard she's eating," he grunted, nodding toward the enclosure where fresh meat lay half-consumed, the tigress's jaws working with deliberate grace. No gruff dismissal now. His eyes lingered on the cubs, a flicker of his own buried loss surfacing. Sarah's gentle hands on their old dog, a compassion he'd armored against after her passing. Harlan didn't stay long, but as he turned away, he clapped Elias's shoulder, the gesture heavy with unspoken alliance. The town's judgment had shifted too, whispers turning from calls for relocation to reluctant tales of the ghost cat's miracle, humans confronting their morality in the face of her silent recovery. Mia Ruiz returned by noon, her camera slung low, not for documentation, but for farewell. She stood beside Elias, watching as the tigress rose fully, stretching her limbs with a low rumble that vibrated the bars, a sound of reclaiming, not restraint. The cubs followed, tumbling after her in playful bounds, their tiny forms a testament to the bond forged in peril. Mia's breath hitched, tears tracing silent paths down her cheeks, the weight of the story pressing against her chest. "She knows," she whispered, voice barely audible, as the tigress nosed the air toward them, nostrils flaring in recognition, no deeper words. The silence between them carried the late revelation, Mia's own flight from the city, chasing images to outrun a fractured family, now reframed by this wild family's quiet triumph. Her lens captured one final frame, the tigress's gaze, golden and knowing, a bridge across species that healed without touch. The state team arrived in the afternoon, their vans rumbling into the lot under a sky clearing to blue. Bureaucracy loomed, protocols for escaped exotics, whispers of distant sanctuaries, but Elias stood firm at the enclosure's gate, his voice steady as he recounted the night's vigil, the birth in the rain, the trust that had held. Lena backed him, her clinical report laced with the human edge of compassion, while the handlers nodded, their wariness yielding to the evidence before them. The tigress pacing with renewed vigor, cubs at her heels, her white form a symbol of misunderstood strength restored. No relocation yet. Time was granted for monitoring, a fragile window where instinct could guide her back to wild edges, far from cages or concrete. As evening fell, the center emptied, leaving Elias alone with the fading light. He walked the perimeter one last time, the chain link cool under his palm, the pines sighing in the breeze. The tigress settled in the enclosure's shadowed corner, cubs curled against her, her breaths evening into the rhythm of dreams. Elias paused at the gate, his hand resting near the bars, feeling the warmth of her presence. No plea now, just peace. A silent justice delivered through the choices that had bound them. Compassion, born from fear's shadow, had revealed them all. The ranger who'd reclaimed his steps, the vet whose hands had steadied life, the handyman whose walls had cracked, the photographer whose lens found heart. The world still needed kindness, Elias thought, in its raw, trembling form, acts that bridged the wild and the worn. Where survival's weight met hope's quiet pull, loyalty across divides, instinct's unyielding call, the beauty of the misunderstood white tiger walking free. Days turned to weeks, the tigress strengthening under careful watch until release came on a crisp morning, the gates opening to the forest's embrace. She stepped out first, white fur gleaming in the sun, cubs trailing in her wake. Elias watched from the tree line, heart hitching as she paused, golden eyes meeting his one final time, a nod of gratitude, silent and profound. Then, with majestic grace, she led them into the horizon, vanishing into the pines like a legend reborn, her form a whisper against the endless green. Subscribe for more stories of compassion, justice, and redemption. Thank you for watching the case of a crying white tigress begged for help, the one who saved her left everyone speechless. See you in the next one.